us for our presentation for this year's Open Ed 24, Uniting Open Educational Practices and the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. It's time. I am Nikki Cannon-Rech, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Diana Botnaru, Kevin Reagan, and Debbie Walker. And we're going to briefly walk you through the similarities between open educational practices and SOTL, and why these two need to be more united than they are at this moment.
The Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, or SOTL for short, was popularized by Boyer in his 1990 book, Scholarship Reconsidered: Priorities of a Professoriate, which broadened the traditional definition of scholarship beyond research to include teaching and service. Boyer argued that teaching should be approached with the same rigor and scholarly inquiry as research, promoting a culture of reflective teaching. In 2013, Peter Felton published his seminal work on practices of good SOTL that can serve as a heuristic for assessing SOTL work while honoring the diversity of SOTL across the globe. These 5 principles articulate a vision of a scholarship that enhances, perhaps even transforms, teaching and learning in higher education. Principle 1 focuses on inquiry into student learning. It usually focuses on students and examines knowledge, skills, attitudes, and habits about learning. However, it can also include explorations of how teaching and teachers influence student learning. Principle number 2, grounded in context. Scholarship of any type builds on what is known, using relevant theory and prior research to establish a firm foundation for inquiry. For SOTL, attention to context also requires sensitivity to the location and dynamics of the inquiry, since all SOTL is rooted in particular classroom, disciplinary, institutional, and cultural contexts. Principle number 3, methodologically sound. SOTL recognizes disciplinary styles, which means that different disciplines use different questions and distinct ways of collecting and analyzing evidence of student learning. At the same time, social science research methods became particularly influential in SOTL. Regardless of the methods employed, good practice in SOTL requires the intentional and rigorous application of research tools that connect the question at the heart of inquiry to student learning. Principle number 4, students as partners. Partnering with students in inquiry is becoming a more widely recognized component of effective SOTL. Engaging students as partners has numerous benefits, as students can help faculty anticipate how their peers might respond to interviews, surveys, or focus group questions, but they can also provide contextual cues about learning environments beyond the classroom. Finally, appropriately public. Because SOTL inquiry typically is iterative and highly contextual, the most appropriate ways to go public should capture and reflect the evolving nature of this form of research. Good practice in SOTL requires that both the process and the products of inquiry are public so that colleagues can critique, use, and then build on this work.
So just as open educational resources can transcend academic disciplines, so too does and can SOTL, which helps the field facilitate inclusivity. SOTL welcomes scholars from all academic disciplines. Additionally, SOTL welcomes various research methods by that same token. Whether you're more familiar with the arts and humanities research methods or qualitative and quantitative research methods, SOTL has a spot and place for you. And finally, SOTL is inclusive in that it advances social justice. We know that there are systemic societal barriers that prevent students from being successful in the classroom. And what's awesome about SOTL is that it works to create a classroom where success is equitable, aka every student has an equal opportunity to succeed.
Most of you here at this conference are probably aware of the OER definition that we default to, and that is according to the United Nations. Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, OER, or any type of educational materials that are in the public domain are introduced with an open license, usually one of the CC license in the United States especially. The nature of these open materials means that anyone can legally and freely copy, use, adapt, and reshare these items. OERs range from textbooks to curricula, syllabi, lecture notes, assignments, tests, and a whole other variety of projects and means by which you would have your students conquer the learning objectives of your course. With OER, we often talk of the 5 R's as coined by Wiley. Those 5 R's reiterate that you may retain, own and control copies of the content, reuse the content in a variety of different ways, revise it according to the license rights, or adapt it, adjust it, and modify it to meet the needs of your specific student group, and also remix or combine the original or revised content with other materials. And finally, redistribute that material or share copies of the original, the revisions, or your remixes with others.
OEP refers to open educational practices. Open educational practices are part of the broader open education landscape. This umbrella of open educational practices includes the OER materials that we are most familiar with, open pedagogy, and open technologies. Open pedagogy expands our network to include how we teach with the open materials. Open technologies incorporates the use of technology that is openly available and is then used to deliver the OER materials in the learning experience.
When you combine or join the open educational practices with what was already described as the strengths of SOTL, you can see why it's time these two things were put together more frequently. Open educational practices typically use OER, which are openly licensed. SOTL calls for appropriately public materials. So creating those materials or using materials that are in that public domain or openly licensed like OER. Open educational practices advocates for inclusivity. SOTL should be grounded in social, cultural, and geographical context, and also inclusive of all of these things to help the learning environment and needs of your students. Open educational practices advocates for open pedagogy, where students are creators and not simply consumers. And as stated, SOTL now specifically states that students should be seen as partners and creators of knowledge, not simply consumers. And open educational practices makes use of the 5 R's that we just discussed. SOTL looks at the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and habits connected to student learning. So if you've been practicing open educational practices and using OER, you have been doing SOTL in many cases, even if you haven't realized it. If you've been doing a lot of SOTL, you may actually just need the slightest segue into OER and open educational practices, especially where in SOTL you are looking to see how your students learned, what their perceptions were as they learned, how engaged they were with the materials and what you were doing in that class. All of these things that we are typically already studying and measuring when we use OER and open educational practices.
Now, as a distinct field of inquiry and study, you might be worried that you can't do or you aren't prepared for SOTL. And if you're in that boat, I have good news. If you're at this conference, there's a big chance that you're doing OEPs or utilizing OERs, which means you're already doing SOTL, to iterate what Nikki said. The OER-SOTL connection is seamless, and by making connections between OER and SOTL, you can help others connect with evidence-based teaching practices and learning opportunities. Ultimately, we would like you to see that there is a clear connection between the two, and as the dynamic landscape of higher education evolves to meet the needs of students, so too will SOTL and OER, as well as the connections that bring them together. Thank you all.